And there's been sort of a tradition of fairs in Europe for as long as there was agriculture. Before any of our ancestors ever came over here, over in Europe, at the end of the year, at the fall of the year, they'd get together for a big fall festival. And they'd bring in their best crops and their best animals, and they'd celebrate the harvest season, you know. So when all our ancestors came over here, they brought that same tradition along with them. They brought that right along with a good tradition, a good hard work ethic, and a good strong religious ethic. So after they were living here and after there were enough of them around here, it was only natural that they wanted to do something the same over here. Buffalo County was settled originally. I think the first election we had in Buffalo County was 1853. 18 people voted in that election. So you can see we didn't have too big a crowd around at that time. But the big immigration from the Germanic countries, from the center of Europe, really flowed in the 60s and the 70s. And by the 70s we had over 10,000 people in Buffalo County, and many of them were starting to talk about we've got to have a fair in Buffalo County. We've got to have a fair because it's good for promoting agriculture, for promoting good products, and it's good for the people, for them to be able to get together and learn from each other. So they set up a committee back there in 1872. Now, you may look at this picture up here. There's lots of pictures like this of farms all over Buffalo County, aren't there? It so happens this is where the first fair was in Buffalo County. This picture was taken after that time, but this picture was taken before 1900. And it shows the farm area where the first fair was held. Does anybody know whose farm that is here? Happens to be the Ant and Fink farm. That probably didn't help, huh? Anyway, it's right next to Cream, right in the center of Buffalo County, which is probably why it was picked in the first place. But the first county fairs in Buffalo County were actually held in Cream. This gives you a little better idea of just exactly where they were. This is the Fink farm. This is Cream, right there. At that time, it was called Eagle Creek. And right there is what's now the Ponderosa Bar. At that time, they had a hotel there. And it was the Lincoln House was the name of the hotel. And it was right in that place there. The fair was actually held on the Ant and Fink farm, and it was held out in this area here, with some of it over on the other side of the creek here, but mainly in this area right here. Now, you could maybe say, how did it get here? Well, back in 1982, the person who was the executive director of our historical society at that time, for the fair board, made a special study to find out the history of the Buffalo County Fair. And we've got a book about the Buffalo County Fair. Great book. We got extra copies of it here if anybody's really interested in it. And it tells most of what I'm going to be covering with you here today. So they got together a committee. And the committee consisted of one person from every township in the county, one person from every village, one person from every city. Just sort of like a county board was, like the county board used to be at least, you know. And so that big grand group got together and they said, well, where are we going to have the county fair? And that ended up, they appointed one of their members, a fellow from Elma named Gates. They appointed one of their members to go out and get some bids and find out where the best places could be. So he went out there and he got bids, and he got bids from 3 different areas for the first fair. So Mr. Gates came back to the committee and he says, well, he says, I saw Buffalo City, Lincoln, and Wamedy. And Buffalo City's offer was like this. Buffalo City says, we'll give you the grounds, We'll fence two sides of it with a tight board fence, and we'll even plant shade trees. Wamedy says, we'll just give you the land. And Lincoln, which is the fair at Cream, Lincoln said, we'll lease you the grounds at $3 an acre, but we'll give you $400 in cash up front. And $400 in cash was like a lot of money back in 1872. Well, just like some of the elections, voting that we used to have on the county board, they didn't pass it unanimously right away. It went through several votes. Finally, it ended up 8 votes for Lincoln and 7 votes for Wamedy. And they went, therefore, with Lincoln as being the first place. They liked the location there, and I think they probably also liked Wamedy for the same reason, because it was very centrally located, and it's geographically centered. Figured it would be a relatively easy place for everybody to come to. So they went ahead and they contracted with Anton Fink here for his property, and went ahead and organized the first Buffalo County Fair. So the first Buffalo County Fair got held in October in 1872. Well, we've got some newspaper reports about that. That was in the Alma Weekly Express. That's a paper that was before the Buffalo County Journal even. And it talks about this first fair, how there were horses entered in the trotting races right away. That's one thing that you about the Buffalo County Fair from the very beginning until horses were out of the picture. One of the biggest things that was happening at the fair were the horse races. And they were not just straight riding races. Usually they were trotting races. And they had riding races too, but the trotting races were the big thing. In that absolute first fair that they had, you can find some Mondovi names here and some names that are probably familiar even today here. 1872, one of the horses in the trotting race was owned by an Inglesby, another one by a Farrington, another one by a Davis of Dover, and another one by an Ing of Alma. I sort of like the article in the Alma Express paper because it ends with this comment here, describing everything that happened in the fair and the various exhibits and things like that. And then it says, with free access to stimulants. In other words, apparently with some booze flowing around the fairgrounds. He said, with free access to stimulants, we saw no fights. And only one tipsy man loomed up, and he probably came from a distance and didn't have time for breakfast. If anybody's having any trouble hearing, just raise your hand and I'll try to speak up more. Let's see, I've got to speak more into this to get more volume, apparently. Huh? Okay. Now, some years later, in 1934, which was about the 50th anniversary of the fair, they went around to some people that were to these first fairs. First 3 fairs were in Cream. And they talked to some of these people about what they remembered about this very first fairs that were held out there in Cream. And one of the persons that they talked to and whose remarks are printed in the Buffalo County Journal in 1934 was from Mrs. Fred Seifert. And she says, we left Gilmanton at 4 o'clock in the morning by wagon, snuggled down deeply and warmly in the buffalo robes which were so common in those days, and the hay which we would later feed the horses with. On the way we passed many ox carts bearing families and stock. A great sight greeted our eyes. It probably was not much more than a handful of people, but it seemed like thousands. You know, at that time everybody lived on the farm and rarely went to town and very rarely saw large groups of people, so this must have been exciting. She says the grounds were surrounded by a high board fence which served as a wall for stalls for the horses and the oxen. Then she talks about the population of the county and what they were speaking and talking about. There, I saw a hand in the back. Did that help? Okay. It's my wife's hand, you know, so I got to pay attention. The population of the county at that time had said, except for the Irish of Irish Valley, some of them New Englanders, and a few Scandinavians in the northern part of the county. Most people at this time were German and Swiss. And the folks didn't have any newspapers and radios, so they were all standing around and visiting at a big picnic. And they were talking mostly in German. There were, the signposts were in German, the speeches were in German, and they were wearing German-type clothing, the women wearing handkerchiefs over their heads and great full skirts. So it was sort of like a little bit of a fall harvest from Europe going on in Buffalo County in 1872. She describes also about the exhibit hall and the various different things she saw there. And what's really kind of intriguing in what they're talking about and seeing is they're seeing some things for the first time that they have ever seen them in their whole life, and they're things that we think are just so common that we just can't imagine without them, you know. But she's saying that the biggest surprise of all was an organ, the first one I had seen in the community. Everybody marveled at this wonderful new invention. Now we think of it's a very old-fashioned invention. And a Burt girl from the southern part of the county knew how to play on it. Then she goes on a little bit farther and she says, but about 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a great shouting of, "Here they come, here they come." And all the people rushed to the gate. For coming down the road, here comes this 4-horse team and pulling a wagon. And what do you think it is? It's the Mondovi Cornet Band. The wagon was built like a hay rack. They had benches in a square facing each other, and the wagon was painted black and red. The band boys were dressed in blue with army caps, sort of like the northern troops during the Civil War. And she says, my, how they played. Then just listen to what she says. She says it was the first band that most of us had ever heard, and people stood around and listened for hours. The first band that most of the people that were there had ever heard. Then they talked to another fellow, an Otto Rabas from Alma, and he mentions about how this was a 3-day fair, and of course the only place anybody could stay was at the Lincoln House. I'll show you a picture of the Lincoln House pretty soon. You can't put many people there. And he said that he walked to get there with his father, and they got there on the second day, and they had to sleep in the hay mow. And on awakening in the morning, they discovered that many other persons were also sleeping in the hay mow. So that's the kind of conditions that was going on out there. Then there's another quotes from Edwin Gans, who was later the publisher of the Buffalo County Journal, and who wrote many historical articles that we've got in our collection. And Edwin Gans lived on the Alma Bluff at that time, and he had a young heifer he wanted to show at the program, and so he walked that heifer from the Alma Bluff over to the fair at Cream, over hill and dale, and that's the way most of the livestock got there. They had to walk them there. If they had a wagon, they probably had the animal walking beside it, but they still had to get most of the livestock there that way. He talks about how there were horse races. The trotting horses had high-wheeled sulkies, and talks about other various exhibits that he was impressed by. But I thought this is another one of these first time I ever saw it stories here. He says, there were also some rabbits shown by the Hague boys. Now, rabbits doesn't sound like a very big deal, does it? But he says, for I had never seen tame rabbits before, outside of in a picture book. Something as common as that, and this was the first time he'd ever seen rabbits. In fact, rabbits were a big part of the early displays and the early prizes that were awarded. Then there's another quote here from Charlie McHale's in Cochrane. I grew up in Cochrane. I bought the first gun I ever owned in my life from Charlie when I was 10 years old. It was an old Spanish-American War 45-70 rifle, and he threw in a box of shells and a shotgun, and I got the whole thing for $4.50. Anyway, Charlie McHale's came over from Cochrane, of course, and he says, my father and my brother Herman and I, we started out in the morning, and we walked to the fairgrounds. Still getting to the fairgrounds by walking, you know. He said, to shorten the trip, we followed no road. We just made a beeline across the fields and the woods. And finally we got to Anton, that's Anton Fink, that's the farmer here. We got to his private driveway, and we came in the fairgrounds through apparently the back way because we didn't have to pay admission. And then he too says, it was there where I heard and saw the first brass band in my life. How well do I remember the great brass tuba horn and the tunes they played. And then he also saw, he says, the first baseball game in my whole life. And he said, I can still see the pitcher jumping around and hollering out at the man up to bat. The person up to bat jumping around and hollering to the pitcher, what kind of a ball do you want? And the pitcher and the person that was up to bat would holler out, throw me a high ball or throw me a low ball. And then that's what he would have thrown to him. And baseball rules obviously have changed a bit over the years. Then there's an Albert Hess. At that time he lived in Arcadia. We had Hesses up in the Nelson area too. And he says, I went to the fair in 1876 when I was 5. And he talks a little bit about what everybody ate when they were there. Now, the only place that was commercial here was the Lincoln House, which certainly wasn't able to serve a large crowd like that. Incidentally, the 1874 fair had a total attendance of 1,500 people turned out for that. Imagine that with the way that they had to get there and the lack of transportation and roads that we had at that time. Well, he said that there wasn't any place that was able to serve food, so everybody packed their lunch and brought their dinner along, and they gathered in shady places at noon and had dinner from the baskets that they brought along. He said there was a stand where they sold soft drinks and bologna. A barrel of red lemonade was free, and they all came in and loaded up with red lemonade in dinner pails. And he said the bologna was a special luxury. 3 good-sized ones sold for 25 cents. And the sales were brisk. Might be good to comment a little bit about ribbons. You know, they were giving awards, you know, first prize, second prize, and third prize premiums for all kinds of things that were entered, and we had judges and everything like that. But you didn't want the blue ribbon in the early days because the blue ribbon was third. The red ribbon was first prize. The white ribbon was second prize. And actually you find that's quite common in the country in those really early days. Blue ribbon didn't become first prize until comparatively later. Now, even though the fairgrounds at Cream were nice and central for the county, and even though they turned out 1,500 people for that 1874 celebration, they still had one big problem, and that was the biggest hotel in town, a Lincoln House. I don't know how many rooms it might have had upstairs, but I'm sure it couldn't have slept more than 10 or 12 people. And that was the only place for miles around, you know, that anybody could stay at. So the biggest complaint and the biggest grumbling that everybody had if they wanted to come to a 3-day fair was that there wasn't any place for us to stay. We had to sleep in the wagons or sleep on the ground. And so they felt that they had to start looking around for a better location in an area that's a little bit more built up. And so they settled, the committee got together again, and they went out and they looked for a place to go to, and they looked for some bids again. And this time the main bidders were Alma and Buffalo City. And the Buffalo City said, we'll give you 8 acres of land, we'll give you $200 cash, and we'll go out to Lincoln, and we'll take down all the buildings and fences, that belong to the Agricultural Society, and we'll take them all to the city of Buffalo in time for the next fair. That was Buffalo City's offer. And Alma's offer was, we will furnish you the grounds for the annual fair free of cost for 10 years, with up to 20 years if necessary. We will fence in all the grounds, we'll dig a well, and we'll put up buildings. The buildings were pretty extensive. They said the horse and cattle stalls were going to handle at least 30, and they were going to put up a hall 24 by 60 feet for it, and some other buildings as well. Well, the committee voted in favor of Alma. So now we're at Alma. Before I was with the County Historical Society here and looking at these old records, I didn't even know that we had even had a fair at Alma, but it was. And it was 1873 to 1883. Now, where do you think the fair was when it was at Alma? Well, here's where it was. We've got the city of Alma up on top here. It's an old plat book map from 1878. And then down below Alma here, where it's in yellow, that's the John Hemrick farm. And that's where today the power plant is. The old original first power plant, the big first stack that went up in Alma, is right there on those same grounds there. This is the river. This is a little backwater slough here. The first fair was held on this side of the slough here, with some usage of the space over there, but mainly right along in there. Yeah, this is what is Highway 35 running right down through here. So that was the location for the fair there. Well, the fair there went pretty good too. These were good years for county fairs. This was a really big thing going on in the county. The first year they had a total of 245 entries, which was substantially up from Lincoln. But they had a problem there, and they almost had a problem like this every so often during the course of the years. And that's, it's awfully close to the Mississippi River. And every so often the Mississippi River would flood. And one time the Mississippi River really did flood during this stretch of time. And that's this next picture here. They didn't have horse races that year, they had boat races. They didn't have any fair at all because the fairgrounds were covered. And as far as contests of skill, it was log rolling. Well, this was about 1882, I think, something like that. And of course, these were boom days in Alma at that time for the logging people. And Alma at that time was a staging center for a lot of logging, so it probably was a logging festival that year instead of a farming festival. But they continued to have some problems like that, and even though the next year they had another nice, good-sized fair, then an article in the paper says, in 1882, high water came again on its way to Iowa and washed the racetrack down toward New Orleans. And the committee said, we better get together, we've got to do some changing again. And so it was soon to leave Alma. But before it left Alma, I want to just sort of describe what the fairgrounds were like at that time. We're used to the strip where all the games of chance are, the carnivals are, and all the amusement things are. Well, this description comes from the paperback at that time, and it talks about they had a walking contest. They had a half-mile track down there for the horse races. That's the one that walks down to New Orleans later on. But they had that. They started out at 9 o'clock in the morning. As many people that wanted to could start going around the track. Prize at 5 o'clock, which was cut off in the afternoon for whoever made the most laps around the track. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, the person that won was a Frank Winter who'd made it 50 times around the track. And that's 25 miles, you know, that he walked in the course of that day. in order to get his red ribbon. And the fellow that came in second was right behind him with 49 laps in that same period of time. So that's the kind of a game of skill we don't see much of anymore, or even then probably. Now there were also shooting exhibitions, and one fella shot 38 out of 40 glass balls thrown up in the area. But I thought a good one was the merry-go-round. We're all used to the merry-go-rounds, and we always think about it when we think about county fairs. Well, the merry-go-round in these years didn't have a motor. What it had was two men and a big crank, and they turned the crank and the merry-go-round went around. Every time it went around, there was a fellow with a bass drum that would hit the bass drum for every circle like that, so they could keep track apparently of how many times it was going around. And there was a hurdy-gurdy on it that would play music at the same time. So that's what the merry-go-rounds were like back at that time. Then over in the exhibition hall, it tells about how a fellow was trying to sell everybody on a new style of plow. Yeah, this plow really works, it really cuts through the ground easy, really easy to pull. And he had 3 horses hooked up on him. He showed him how easy it worked. And then he took one horse off, and then he showed him how easy that plow went back and forth. Then he took another horse off with only 1 horse on it now, and it plowed just as good and just as easy. Then he took that horse off. Then he took another fellow on top of his shoulders, hooked himself up to the plow, and plowed another row, just to show them that that plow really could work. So that's the kind of machinery demonstrations we had back in those years, in the 1880s or so. The biggest thing probably was the horse racing, and the horse racing was really big during these particular years. The trotting races were the big event of the day. They paid the biggest prize of money in the course of the day was for trotting races. They did have, the trotting races of course had a sulky behind them, and a person riding in the sulky behind them. But they also did have some riding races too, and those were called running races, and they were almost always bareback. And of course, they always had to have a political speech. Way back when they started this thing in 1872, they said, the president of the society has to either give a speech at 3 o'clock or find somebody to give a speech at 3 o'clock. And they almost always had somebody running for public office, and many times these were people running for statewide office. The 1888 one, for instance, had both candidates for governor speaking. In this particular one that I'm looking at right now, the state senator gave a talk on the importance of clover and all about the taxes on clover. Must have really been interesting. One feature of Alma was Alma had a Schutzen Park right above the fairgrounds. And Schutzen Park is where they would go and they would target shoot with single shot rifles, and they were great marksmen, an old Swiss-German custom. And they had a big dance hall in connection with their Schutzen Park, which was right directly above the old fairgrounds. And when the fair was over in the course of the day, everybody would adjourn up to the Schutzen grounds, and they would dance away the evenings. There's a lot of names here that you're probably all familiar with that were involved in those years. During the Alma years, most of them tend to be more Alma names. Well, it includes Frank Gilman and J.A. Tester, John Beeler, John Haig, Philip Zeller, that's Wamedy, Robert Lees, he was judge a number of years, Charlie Shepley, a store operator in Buffalo City at one time, Alma at one time, and Mondovi at one time. All right, then what do you think happened? They were worried about all the water, and they were thinking we maybe ought to be doing something. And then what did Hemrick do? Hemrick's the man that owned the land that they were having the fairs on in Alma. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad was coming up this side of the river. At that time it was the Winona, Alma, and Northern Railroad, and it was buying up land. And it bought land right through the middle of the fairgrounds, 100 yards wide. Hemrick sold them a strip for the right-of-way for the railroad. And so that, of course, just cut the center and the fair and the racetrack areas and things like that right out of any possible usage. So they had to move from that time on. So they went out and they looked around again. This time, the people up in the northern county put on a real good pitch for the fairgrounds. And they decided that it wasn't that important to have to be in the exact center of Buffalo County, because in the center of Buffalo County it's real hard to go east and west. It's not that hard to go north and south, but because of the way the valleys and the roads run, it isn't that convenient to go back and forth anyway. Mondovi made a very good offer for them, and they decided that they were going to switch to the Mondovi area. City of Mondovi offered grounds and buildings. They included providing for maintaining a half-mile racetrack, and the fair got moved there in 1884. It's almost yesterday. And there's where it is. It's not where it is now. First fairs were held out in what everybody up in the Mondovi area here calls the Flats, and that's down there between Highway 37 and Water Street, and is that area down there. That's shown on the map in the red. They had some great fairs there. The first year that they had the fair here at Mondovi, the number of exhibits that were brought in, or a number of animals that were entered, were twice as high as the best one that they had ever had in Alma before. And this starts a stretch of time that probably for about the next 50 years had some just really big, fantastic county fairs here. In fact, Buffalo County had some of the biggest county fairs in the state of Wisconsin. They had some attractions that were known nationally. They had some attractions that were known statewide, and just some amazing county fairs for a county the size of Buffalo County. But I think sometimes we forget Buffalo County was a very, very leading agricultural county in agricultural progress in those early years, in the late 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s. We had a lot of the testing of new crops and things like that was actually being done in the Buffalo County area here. A lot of the leading research was actually being done down here. And we were working very closely with the University of Wisconsin Agricultural Department at that time. And the names of many Buffalo County farmers were known very well down in Madison at the seat of our government. Anyway, they then moved it up here on the flats, and that helped draw more exhibits because it was that much easier at Mondovi to get exhibits in from people in Trempealeau, Eau Claire, and Pippin counties, because the transportation was quite a bit easier for those people to come in as well, and the number of entries, as I mentioned, doubled during that time. I said that there was a lot of real good entertainment that would just amaze you for this time, and at the big event at the fairs that were held at the Mondovi Flats was the balloon ascensions. They brought in big hot air balloon, and they built up a fire underneath it and heated it up for several hours during the morning until it was ready to go up, and everybody would stand around and watch it. Had a gondola hanging underneath it with a man and a dog in it, you know, and then up it would go and everybody would watch it. And then after it got up high enough, the man and the dog would jump out and they'd parachute down. Quite a sensational sight for Mondovi back in those years, I would think. And another one of those firsts happens while we're out here in the flats in Mondovi. The first demonstration of the phonograph was held here on the flats in Buffalo County. Just imagine, you know, we think the phonograph is really old-fashioned music today, you know. Nobody had ever seen a phonograph in Buffalo County before it had showed up here on the flats at one of the Buffalo County fairs. Anyway, the Edison people were there, and they had say recordings that had music and recordings by humorous people like Josh Billings, and people were all lined up. They could hear 3 cylinders played for 10 cents. Now, another big event that happened up here in Buffalo City, was from Buffalo City, that happened up here in the flats. And at that time, the only buffalo farm we ever had in Buffalo County's history until just the last 20 years or so, when we've had some buffalo in the county. But the only buffaloes that we ever had in those early years were the buffaloes that were on the Huber farm, which is above the Cochran and Belvedere area, up on top of the bluff, and the Huber brothers got some buffaloes. They got some buffaloes out in South Dakota, and they bought those buffalo out there, and they drove out there with a horse and wagon, and when they got out there and they had bought the buffaloes, they took the bottom out of the wagon, herded the buffaloes into the wagon, so it was just sort of like a walking fence, and they walked those buffaloes back to Buffalo County, and set up this buffalo farm up there on top of the ridge there. And here's a picture taken on their farm up there. You can see the heavy fencing that they've got up there, built like a palisade or a fort in the back there, and with the old-fashioned split rail fencing on the side like that. We've got an old history article from the Yama Journal that tells about one time when they stampeded. One time the whole herd got out and went down through Rose Valley, some 50, 60 head strong. But anyway, they brought their buffalo up here one time, and that was the big thing during that particular year at the county fair. And the newspaper article in the Mondovi paper says, the Huber brothers of Cochran exhibited a pair of buffalo, and not just buffalo, but also a brown bear. They had a brown bear that they brought along. And then some kind of a long-legged bird. The newspaper doesn't tell us what kind of a long-legged bird it was, you know. But I would assume it wasn't one of our common cranes like we have around here. It wasn't a hare or something like that. Now, during this stretch of time, we get to this 1888, and we've actually got this 1888 fair book down in our Buffalo County collection of things, you know. We got quite a collection of things. And I think it's just a little interesting to take a little bit of a look at that, because that tells you a little bit about what county fairs were like in those years. The big thing was, of course, the Trials of Speed over on the right. And that was the big purses. Most of the prizes that were being awarded probably averaged around $1, $2, something like that for first, and quarter, 50 cents, things like that for second, for the various things that you applied for. But the big money was in horse racing. And you see up there they had it in two classes. In the green race for horses 4 years old, that was a trotting race. And the second one in the afternoon, which was for the best horses, was also a trotting race. In order to enter the race, you had to put up 10% of the purse. So it cost you $7.50 to enter the run race and $12.50 to enter the second race, for instance. Then the winners got the premiums that are shown up there, like depending upon which race it was, first prize got either $65 or $40. And then the running race there, that's the one I said, you know, was riding horseback, not with a sulky behind the trotters. And that carried substantially less money. You could enter that one for $1, you know. Purse was only $10. But then again, first prize is only $6 too, you know. And then they had more races. They didn't have any races on the first day. The races were on the second day. Third day they had more races. Some of them we're still not really sure what they even were. We don't know what the free-for-all was, but the free-for-all was also a pretty good sized money one too. And this wasn't like the horse races we have today when you watch them on television, you know, they run them once and that's it. If you stumble a little bit, you're out, you know. And these were the best 3 out of 5 for the trottings and the best 2 out of 3 for the running races. On the committee members over on the side there, you can see they had committee members from all over the entire county, a lot of names that are familiar up in this area and familiar in every other place. You can see at that particular time, the president of the society was J.W. Wheeler, from Mondovi, of course. Then, if we go back into the book a little bit more, it tells about what they were giving prizes for. And that tells you a little bit about what kind of livestock they had around there. At that time, the big lead thing was big, heavy, good draft horses. That was the tractors in those days, and that was the most important thing that they had. And the horses that they had in the In the premiums were Norman and Percheron horses, and Clydes and Shire horses, each of them being considered as one category. Then they had standard bred, which would be the ones that would pull the buggies. And then they had grade horses, which were non-thoroughbred. They were really trained, and they would require that you had to show a pedigree in order to be able to enter any of these contests as far as awards are concerned. Then in other livestock, how about cattle, you know? The most popular cattle back in this time, we don't even hardly hear of today, was Durhams. And the next was Jerseys, and then third was Holsteins. And then was grade cattle. Then they go into other various kinds of livestock. Then they go into awards for just a tremendous list of different kinds of crops and different kinds of produce, you know. They've got awards for Timothy seed. They've got awards for white corn. They've got awards for about 8 different kinds of potatoes and turnips and carrots and so on. They got awards for crock butter, cheese, honey, different kinds of bread. Then they got awards for lots of different kinds of fruit. Wine was big at that time. There's a lot of grape entries here. Also jellies. The ladies were getting awards for just about every kind of jelly that you could imagine. Each one was in a separate category. And so at that time when you came to the county fair, everybody was bringing something along to enter into the fair. They even had a special area at that time for the children. They had special prizes for the children for the drawings that were in crayon, drawings in pen and ink, and drawings in lead pencil. And then they had one award for plain writing and one award for ornamental writing. You know, the beautiful old calligraphy writing that we used to see that was just absolutely beautiful. And they even had, and today I don't think we ever see that anymore, and we don't even see hardly any plain writing anymore, I don't think either. Then they had embroidery for a contest for the ladies to enter into, all different kinds of sewing and mending skills. I really like this one down here. They had a special category in which they awarded a prize for the neatest darned stocking. If any of you have worn, probably can't even hardly remember wearing darned stockings. But it used to be very big, obviously. And then they go on with various other things as well that they were having awards for in those days. Incidentally, most of the information that I'm telling you about really is in this particular book here. And we published this in 1982, and if any of you are interested in it, it's got all the pictures that we're using, or just about all of them. And most of the stories that I'm telling you about are from newspaper articles and things that are printed in here. If any of you are interested in getting them, you can pick them up from Kelly here afterwards. The original price on them when we first issued them was for $3.50, and we haven't raised the price. Now, during the time that they were on the flats, mentioned that J.W. Whelan was president. Other names that are familiar around here are names like Orlando Brown. It's probably more Modena, actually, in Gilmanton area. Talks about different people that were president of the board during these years. W.L. Hauser, L.H. Howard, P.H. Ernest, Glenn Pierce, Roy Tanner, all familiar Mondovi names here. And mentions G.L. Broadfoot was vice president for 9 years. So then they made the final move to where they are now. The problem at that time was still that the horse racing was becoming to be such a big thing, and it was such a problem to maintain the fairgrounds, and the city offered to build them fairgrounds and building and an excellent track and a grandstand, and that was on the present site of the Mondovi Fairgrounds. So here we are, out in the fairgrounds. Quite a bit later than 1894 as far as this picture is concerned, but I think a lot of you can probably remember the grandstand there. And that's where everybody went to for the big celebrations, for the big public shows and things that were held. And like I was mentioning before here, we did have some really impressive shows and some really big-time shows in Buffalo County, especially in that earlier stretch of those years. And they started building buildings, putting up stock barns, racehorse barn, exhibition hall, office building, and of course the big grandstand. The show kept trying to outdo itself every year, trying to have something bigger and better. This particular, I mentioned before about how big horses were in Buffalo County, and this was Mondovi's biggest claim to fame in those early years, was this horse that was Horace Greeley. And he was owned by James Hunter, but there was a number of other Mondovi people that owned him together. Big purebred Norman horse, same kind of horse that we call Percheron today. And Horace Greeley won national awards, became one of the most desired stallions to breed to, as far as the breeders of these type of horses all over the country. And they had just great success with him, and he brought just all kinds of fame as far as Buffalo County was concerned, and particularly Mondovi was concerned. I was mentioning that the fairs started getting bigger and bigger as far as the shows that were concerned. This particular fair right here had a Japanese troupe from Japan that was performing, a Ludington brass band from Menominee that was performing, a symphony orchestra, I can't read the print, but from some large city that was performing, trained seal acts, and of course all the things that you'd normally expect down through the carnival area, the merry-go-round, blacktop show, and midway attractions and so on. You can see some names there that are real definitely Mondovi names, like Parrish and Dillon and Litcher. Now we come to 1912. This was probably the biggest and most extravagant fair that Mondovi ever had. And the big feature of that particular day was the airplane shows. On every day of the fair, in other words, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, as the article says, it says that he's going to go up at least 2 times with that airplane. And take a look at that airplane. You ever seen these pictures of Orville Wright when he flew the first plane? And the plane looks just like that. And this is 1912, and that's actually a Wright-built plane that this man's flying in. And he, at the time that this man was in Mondovi in 1912, he held the world's record at that time for having flown higher than any other person had ever flown. And we actually had it here, flying right off of our fairgrounds behind the school area there. Back in 1912, we had that actually here. If we look down here a little bit farther, political speeches, we had by the man who was governor at that time, by the man who was running against him for governor, the rest of the things that they got there. For prizes every afternoon, baseball games every forenoon, hipper dogs, highly trained dogs, and black shows usually hardboard that was daily with plantation songs and southern melodies. I can even remember some of them. Then to the top parade, showing all the animals go around the track and the parade parade. And like I said, from the state, leaders, especially at the time. There was an emperor one time that said, if any of you are getting married, one night caught in front, and good thing will be prize getting married. And let's say, bring that. And it's the best fair barbecue in the state. Then I'd like to end here. After the rest, that's the way fairs were rolling here in Buffalo County at that time. The paper could tell, you know, that the fair was getting fancier, because it said, in the paper it said, children of these new times. That's early 1900s, about 100 years ago maybe. Children of these times are satisfied being pushed merry-go-rounds on real fair churches and merry-go-rounds. They colored horses out of jerseys. And the old people are coming over the hills from Nona across, hoping to get a ride in their. So that more or less is up to the present time. And of course, level they were at in those early years. This was the biggest thing happening in Buffalo County. Nobody had anything competing with it. This is where you win. As time grew more modern, as more machinery comes along, as more advancement comes along, as it gets easier and easier to go everywhere else, the county fairs, all of them all over the state, start getting smaller and smaller. But they do also start changing. And during this particular period of time is when we see the 4-H emerge, when we see the showing animals at the county fair, where young people are learning how to show the animals, where they're falling in love with their heifer or their swine or whatever they happen to be showing, taking care of all summer long, and living for the thrill of showing the animal at the county fair and the hope of getting and bringing home a prize for that animal. And I think that taught some tremendously good things to all our young people during those years. The shows still continued at a pretty good level. The grandstand performances still were impressive. They still had, they didn't have horse races much anymore, but now we had tractor pulls. We had big machinery demonstrations as far as the exhibition area was concerned. The show areas included a lot of things like demolition derbies and car racing and things like where you drive a car at high speed and hurdle over another car. Things like that would still be common things that I'm sure many of us in the room here probably can remember some of those, because those were still going on at that time there. The fair was changing. It wasn't changing all for the bad, but it was getting smaller, and it was getting to be less of a big thing than it had been for many, many years. It was supported well, though, and the county continued to support it well, and the city of Mondovi continued to support it well. They continued to add buildings there. Let's see, I just noticed here, I mentioned about how they offered to do the marriages for free that one night, and that was in 1931 when they had the free marriages. In 1948, the KSTP barn dance program was here. It cost them $400 to bring them in. They had other things that they saw in the 1950s, included wrestling matches, Delbert. We were talking a little early about the wrestling matches that we could remember in our young days at the county fair, and lots of rodeo riding, lots of that type of thing. Roping, I can definitely remember that, the rodeo and riding kind of things, performances, in addition to the livestock judging. And the tradition still continued for the great livestock parade. You know, at the end of the, usually on the third day, all the animals that had been entered in the fair during the course of the year, course of the fair, would all line up, and they would all take a big circle all around in front of the grandstand so that everybody could see everybody and everybody that had been entered. And those were really kind of thrilling to watch. One newspaper article mentions that the parade this year was so long that the front of the parade almost touched the back of the parade. We also had half a mile of people and their animals that were exhibiting in the county fair. So the county fair has taught a lot of really good things to a lot of generations of people, and it's really given some tremendous service, I think, to our county when we think back on it. For example, here's Paco. He's an auctioneer and a real estate broker now over in Arcadia, but that's just a typical picture of how proud you felt after you've shown your animal and after you've won a prize. Now that takes us up to today, and today, I think we're still doing well as I think we could hope to in our present modern age, where we've got everything competing for our attention. Now we've got tractor pulls going on instead of horses pulling. We've got meat animal sales. The first meat animal sales, I think, started somewhere in the 70s, and were a great encouragement as far as the young people are concerned, as far as showing their animals. Got a demolition derby, like I was mentioning here before. Bennett Valley Gray Band, as it shows here, and that's always been popular around here. Incidentally, you'll see, this is the 2005 ad. This is right now. And ecumenical worship services. They had worship services quite a few years back, but they were put on by different churches for their different groups. But for about the last 20 years, probably something like that, we've had ecumenical worship services as well. They got farm tractor pulls, all the various different awards, and disc jockey and music and so on in the course of the evening. I should mention probably that among the firsts was beer was banned on the premises in Mondovi for most of the years of the county fair until after World War II, and we had all these World War II veterans back home again. You know, they were used to imbibing a little bit in the Legion halls. You know, so they thought they ought to have a tent out here at the Buffalo County Fair. And in 1968, they asked if they could put up a beer tent at the Buffalo County Fair. It was turned down. Well, it wasn't turned down. It just got tabled. But 3 years later, in 1971, that's the first year that we ever had a beer tent in the Buffalo County Fairs. So that kind of covers kind of a general history of the fair for you all. Like I said, I think we've gained a lot over the years from this. It certainly put Buffalo County on the map in the early years, made Buffalo County agriculturally pretty doggone famous, and it certainly encouraged the breeding of fine livestock, which is what put Buffalo County on the map, and the building up of good kinds of crop seeds and the right kind of experimentation and things like that. I think it's what probably also put Buffalo County in the leading forefront of erosion control practices, and Buffalo County is absolutely the leader in the state of Wisconsin in erosion control, probably because we got more hills and valleys and bridges than any other county in the state of Wisconsin. But here's where all the early tests and things like that were done. Really made people interested in doing a good job of farming, being good citizens, and I think it taught them a lot of darn good principles. We got grandparents and grandchildren day to day here. And I think that the fairs have taught us a lot, but it's also the same things that I think that we've also learned from these grandparents of ours. And that's things like, you know, first of all, during the time of the older people here today, you've seen everything changed from horses to cars and even airplanes. You've seen electricity come back to come out from the farms where it wasn't at all until after the 40s. We've seen the common outdoor outhouse disappear and turn over into indoor plumbing. We've seen the weekly newspaper, if it came at all, change to television and CNN. We've seen those phonographs change to Walkmans and music in everybody's ear as they walk around. We've seen arithmetic change into computers and things like that. But one thing hasn't changed, and I think that's the thing that made our ancestors' successes, made the Buffalo County Fair a success, and made all of our parents a success. And that is, some simple things never change. Things like working hard does pay off. And simple things are the biggest joy. And sticking to it is what gets it done. And helping each other is the way we get it done. And love conquers all problems. Those are the principles, I think, that brought us to where we are. I hope we can pass them on to all the grandchildren that are here today and to their grandchildren. Thank you for coming.